In the middle of a busy African neighborhood, surrounded by street vendors, honking minibuses, and dusty roads, one small object quietly changed history. It wasn't a shiny prototype or a futuristic lab device. It was a broken speed bump. It started like this. A delivery truck approached the intersection, its suspension already worn from years of rough terrain. As the driver rolled over what used to be a speed bump, but was now a jagged strip of concrete, the entire vehicle jerked violently. The rear shocks bottomed out, metal met metal, and something snapped underneath. The truck skidded to a halt, traffic backed up, and frustrated drivers shouted over the noise. To most, it was just another day in the city. Another broken road. Another damaged vehicle. But for one passerby watching the chaos unfold, this wasn't an inconvenience. It was a question waiting for an answer. His name was Elias, a quiet mechanical tinkerer who ran a tiny repair shop built out of shipping containers. He had spent years fixing broken shocks, bent axles, and cracked control arms, almost always caused by terrible road conditions. But the moment he saw that truck's suspension collapse, something clicked. Later that evening, he went back to his workshop. Under dim light and surrounded by piles of springs, shock absorbers, and scrap metal, Elias began sketching. Not just a better shock, but an entirely different approach to how a vehicle should absorb impact. Traditional suspension systems relied on predictable surfaces, smooth highways, engineered pavements. But Africa didn't offer predictability. Roads changed by the week. One day flat, the next day cratered. Potholes multiplied, speed bumps eroded, and vehicles suffered because they weren't designed for chaos. Elias believed suspension shouldn't just handle impact, it should intelligently react to it. Over the next few weeks, he dismantled old suspension parts, salvaged motorcycle shocks from local scrapyards, and even repurposed mountain bike absorbers. What he created was strange, ugly, and completely unconventional. A triple-layer hybrid shock that combined mechanical springs, gas compression, and a small hydraulic damper. But what made it different wasn't the parts, it was the logic. Instead of a single compression point, Elias engineered 3 sequential stages. Small bumps used only the outer coil. Medium impacts engaged the hydraulic core. Extreme shocks activated a final gas chamber designed to resist bottoming out. No computers, no advanced sensors, just clever engineering for unpredictable roads. But ideas are cheap unless they're tested. So Elias installed one of his prototypes on an old Toyota Hilux that everyone in town called the donkey because no matter how much abuse it took, it never quit. The next morning around sunrise, he drove it straight toward the broken speed bump that started it all. Onlookers watched as the truck rolled forward. The front wheels hit first. The prototype compressed in stages: coil, damper, gas. No clink. No bottom out. No sparks. The rear wheels followed. Same result. People blinked. The truck didn't shake. It didn't bounce. It just absorbed. Within a week, local taxi drivers and delivery workers wanted to try it. Within a month, word spread beyond the city. Engineers from nearby universities visited the container workshop, curious how a self-taught mechanic created a suspension system that international manufacturers had never considered. Within a few months, he could no longer keep up with the requests. Each shock had to be built by hand, tested, adjusted, rebuilt, and tested again. The waiting list grew from a handful of locals to logistics companies, mining operators, and even NGOs that needed vehicles to survive off-road terrain. But scaling a mechanical invention wasn't like selling homemade gadgets. He needed manufacturing partners, standardized production, and legal certification. The kind of infrastructure that felt a world away from a shipping container workshop. That's when the first big offer arrived. A foreign auto parts distributor from Europe reached out after hearing about the 3-stage shock system through university contact. They offered a licensing deal, good money, a serious production line, and international patents. But there was a catch. The product's branding, design, and even country of origin would shift to Europe. It would become their invention, manufactured under their name. Elias hesitated. He wasn't obsessed with fame, but giving up the identity of something born from African roads and African problems didn't sit right. He politely refused. The rejection made waves. Some people called him stubborn. Others called him patriotic. But to Elias, it wasn't about nationalism. It was about context. He believed the invention belonged to the environment that created it. Another offer soon followed, this time from a major Asian automotive company. They didn't want to erase the origin, but they wanted full design control and exclusivity. That meant no local manufacturing, no independent distribution, no upgrades without approval. The tech would be integrated into premium off-road SUVs priced far beyond what locals could afford. Again, he declined. Word of his refusals spread even faster than the success of the suspension itself. Suddenly, investors, journalists, and engineers were showing up not to test prototypes, but to understand the man behind the invention. That attention brought another challenge: scrutiny. Government regulators wanted documentation. Automotive safety boards wanted certifications. Patent attorneys wanted filings. None of these things were free, and Elias still operated out of welded shipping containers and borrowed tools. Then came the meeting that changed everything. A consortium of African engineers, entrepreneurs, and industry veterans invited Elias to present his invention at a regional mobility conference. He arrived wearing his usual grease-stained overalls, carrying a prototype wrapped in an old towel. When he stepped into the hall, he found executives in suits, engineering professors with laptops, and journalists setting up cameras. Most inventors would have presented a slideshow. Elias simply lifted the shock onto the table, pressed the piston down with his body weight, and let the triple-stage system speak for itself. As the device compressed cleanly, transitioning through its 3 damping phases, the room leaned in. No one expected elegance from something built from motorcycle parts and salvage scraps. What followed next was unexpected: applause. But more importantly, one person in that room did more than applaud. He walked straight up to Elias after the session and introduced himself as the founder of a growing African auto parts manufacturing startup with plants in Botswana and South Africa. He wasn't offering to relocate the idea to Europe or rebrand it in Asia. He wanted to produce it domestically, at scale. And for the first time, Elias didn't feel like he had to compromise. Still, a bigger question loomed. Could a grassroots African invention survive the brutal world of automotive competition? Established brands wouldn't quietly allow a disruptive suspension system to cut into their off-road market share. If Elias proceeded, he'd be stepping into an industry where patents, politics, and aggressive corporate tactics are as real as potholes and speed. But by now, the suspension was being tested in places Elias could never have imagined: rugged mining convoy trucks in Zambia, safari vehicles in Kenya, and even electric motorcycles navigating Ghana's chaotic streets. The data told a compelling story: fewer breakdowns, longer shock life, smoother rides, and lower maintenance costs. That moment arrived unexpectedly, sparked by a viral video posted by a travel vlogger who had no idea what he was documenting. While on safari in Kenya, he filmed a rugged off-road Jeep gliding over brutal terrain, deep ruts, loose rocks, and uneven slopes, without the usual bone-shaking rattles. The clip showed coffee cups barely moving in their holders as the vehicle bounced over obstacles that would normally send passengers flying. Viewers flooded the comments asking, "What suspension is that?" And "Why isn't every off-road car like this?" Within 48 hours, the video had crossed 1 million views. Within a week, major automotive forums picked it up. Engineers debated diagrams. Off-road enthusiasts demanded aftermarket availability. But the twist came when a well-known automotive journalist from a large U.S. publication decided to trace the suspension's origin. He expected to find a global brand, a big-name manufacturer, or a European aftermarket tuning company. Instead, his search led him to a shipping container workshop in the suburbs. His article, titled "The Suspension Miracle from a Scrap Workshop in Africa," exploded across tech and automotive news outlets. It wasn't charity, and it wasn't romanticism, it was respect. He broke down the mechanics, tested the prototype himself, and concluded that for unpredictable terrain, this system outperformed some high-end commercial shocks costing 10 times more. Suddenly, the industry giants could no longer ignore Elias. Emails turned into phone calls. Phone calls turned into official inquiries. Testing labs wanted samples. Fleet operators wanted pricing. and aftermarket distributors wanted exclusivity. The invention had outgrown the workshop. The African manufacturing startup stepped in, helping Elias establish proper tooling, materials sourcing, and standardized production. The first official batch of shocks rolled off the line, still rough around the edges, still stamped with their hometown origin, but finally ready for real-world deployment. Truck companies in southern Africa began fitting them onto delivery fleets. Safari operators ordered them in bulk. Mining trucks used them in harsh conditions where traditional suspension systems regularly failed. Reports came back showing reduced maintenance costs, fewer breakdowns, and improved safety on dangerous terrain. But with success came the reaction Elias had been warned about. A European manufacturer filed a legal challenge, claiming elements of the design resembled existing patents, even though Elias' system worked on different principles. A large Asian automotive brand began offering dealerships deep discounts on their high-end suspension units, on the condition they didn't test or stock Elias models. Meanwhile, online voices questioned the idea that a major automotive breakthrough could emerge from Africa at all. Yet every attempt to discredit the invention collided with a simple, stubborn fact. The results were real. Fleet owners didn't care about skepticism. They cared that their vehicles lasted longer. Safari guides didn't care about politics. They cared that tourists stopped complaining about neck pain. Miners didn't care about patent wars. They cared that their haul trucks didn't break down 100 kilometers from the nearest service depot. And then, suppress. Governments began paying attention. Infrastructure ministries from several African nations contacted Elias' team with a proposition. They didn't want a suspension for vehicles. They wanted to collaborate on data to redesign road safety standards. If roads couldn't be fixed overnight, perhaps vehicles could adapt smarter and faster. The suspension system was no longer just a product. It was becoming part of a conversation about self-sufficient engineering on a continent that had spent decades importing solutions for problems no one else fully understood. Yet, even with growing success at home, one more challenge lay ahead, bigger than corporate pressure, bigger than patent fights, and bigger than viral headlines. It was the question of global adoption. Could this tough, modular, triple-phase suspension technology, born from a broken speed bump, compete at scale in markets dominated by massive corporations, billion-dollar R&D departments, and fiercely guarded supply chains? What happened next was a collision between two worlds, the grassroots innovation ecosystem that birthed the invention and the global automotive industry that would determine its fate. To break into international markets, Elias needed certifications, not YouTube hype, not news articles, but cold, scientific validation from accredited testing facilities. These tests involved stress rigs, thermal chambers, vibration cycles, and durability simulations that mimicked years of real driving in just a few weeks. Most small inventors crumble at this stage, not because their ideas fail, but because the testing costs more than a house. But something unexpected happened. The U.S. automotive journalist who wrote the viral article hadn't just published a story and moved on. He had quietly contacted a nonprofit engineering foundation dedicated to supporting underrepresented innovation in emerging markets. After reviewing Elias' documentation, they agreed to sponsor the suspension's testing campaign. It was the first time Elias saw his invention placed on a gleaming steel test bench rather than under a dusty pickup truck. Engineers ran simulations at 70 degrees Celsius heat, then at freezing temperatures. They overloaded the compression cycles beyond recommended limits. They tested for fatigue, resonance, cavitation, leakage, and thermal expansion. Most prototypes fail somewhere in this brutal process. Elias' prototype didn't pass everything, but it passed enough to earn preliminary certification for off-road commercial applications. This was a breakthrough no corporation could ignore. Suddenly, fleet procurement managers in Latin America requested demos. Mining companies in Australia wanted to test units on their haul trucks. A Canadian snow rescue team asked if the shock could be adapted for Arctic conditions. Each inquiry came with new demands: improved seals, corrosion resistance, modular mounts, and optional telemetry sensors. The invention began evolving beyond anything Elias had initially drawn on paper. With input from global engineers, He developed a second-generation model with interchangeable damping cartridges, meaning the suspension could be tuned for deserts, mountains, tundra, or urban potholes by simply replacing an inner component instead of the entire unit. But while the engineering matured, something else shifted even more dramatically: the narrative. For decades, Africa was treated as a consumer of automotive technology, not a creator. But journalists began telling a different story. They wrote about an inventor who designed for realities ignored by wealthy nations. They wrote about decentralization in manufacturing. They wrote about a future where innovation emerged from necessity rather than funding. Then came the moment that forced the global industry to pay full attention. During an international off-road endurance event in Chile, a convoy of vehicles equipped with conventional high-end suspension dropped out over the course of 2 days due to component failures. But one vehicle, an older Land Cruiser fitted with Elias second-generation shocks, completed the entire course without a single suspension-related issue. Video footage showed dust clouds, violent jumps, and unforgiving terrain, yet the cruiser kept going. When the driver was interviewed, he casually said, "The shocks are African. They don't break." Those 3 words ricocheted across social media. Forums debated them. Engineers analyzed them. Automotive executives disliked them. Because if an affordable, modular, reparable suspension system from Africa could outperform premium Western components in real-world conditions, it wasn't just a novelty, it was a threat. Big manufacturers started calling again, but this time with a different tone. They wanted partnerships instead of buyouts. They wanted research collaboration instead of exclusivity. They wanted licensing instead of relocation. The leverage had shifted. But Elias remembered something important. This journey began with a broken speed bump in a neighborhood where people couldn't afford expensive off-road shocks. He didn't want his invention to end up as a high-end luxury accessory. So instead of selling out or going premium first, he made a move that stunned the industry. He launched a small division dedicated to low-cost models for local motorcycle taxis, delivery trikes, and farm pickups. These were the vehicles that suffered most from bad roads and could benefit the fastest. Manufacturers watching from Europe and Asia didn't understand the logic. Why prioritize small margins over big contracts? Why go bottom-up when you could go top-down? But Elias understood something they didn't. Innovation is not only measured in revenue, it's measured in relevance. The invitation arrived sealed in a plain white envelope with no branding, just a return address from Kigali, Rwanda. Inside was a short message from the newly formed African Mobility Research Council, asking Elias to present his suspension system at a summit focused on continental transportation autonomy. At first, it sounded like just another conference, another speech, another panel of experts debating theoretical futures. But this summit wasn't about theory. It was about infrastructure, logistics, defense mobility, and industrial independence. The guest list included policymakers, defense engineers, electric vehicle pioneers, and top-level representatives from African automakers who were tired of importing overpriced parts not built for African conditions. When Elias arrived, he expected polite interest at best. Instead, he found urgency. Government officials from landlocked nations talked about vehicles wearing out faster due to poor roads. Logistics experts explained how suspension failures delayed shipments and wrecked supply chains. Agricultural departments described pickup trucks breaking down during harvest season, costing farmers income. What had started as a mechanic's personal project was suddenly being framed as a strategic advantage. Then one presentation changed everything. A group of military engineers from West Africa showed field data demonstrating how conventional military vehicles struggled in rugged border zones due to suspension failures, while locally modified units equipped with prototypes based on Elias design maintained mobility. The implications were undeniable. In regions where paved roads were sparse, smarter suspension wasn't just about comfort, it was about national capability. That's when the council introduced an audacious concept: a multi-nation collaboration to develop Africa's first homegrown rugged utility vehicle, designed from scratch for African terrain, and they wanted Elias' suspension system to be the core mechanical innovation around which the platform would be built. The room went silent. Elias stared at the slide on the screen, which showed a silhouette of a modular utility chassis with his suspension units highlighted. It felt impossible, surreal, too big, too far from a shipping container workshop. But then came the part that truly caught global industry attention. The Council intended to share the platform design as open hardware, allowing member nations to manufacture and improve it locally instead of depending on foreign suppliers. This wasn't just innovation, it was decentralization. However, such a move would trigger consequences. Big manufacturers would not accept a parallel hardware ecosystem emerging outside their supply chains. Already, quiet warnings were circulating. A major automotive corporation accused Elias of violating trade agreements, another hinted at potential patent disputes, and a third began buying up metal suppliers in regions where Elias partners source materials. The battle lines were forming, not with weapons but with logistics, supply chains, and legal filings. But just when the situation looked like it would stall under pressure, something unexpected shifted the momentum. A major South American mining group released a public report praising the durability and cost efficiency of vehicles fitted with Elias system, noting reduced downtime in remote mining sites and improved driver safety. The report went viral among industrial operators, who cared far more about performance than politics. Suddenly, fleet managers from Canada, Brazil, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan requested evaluations. They didn't care that the system came from Africa. They cared that it worked where theirs didn't. Now global media began reframing the narrative. Headlines read, "The African suspension taking over rough terrain fleets. Why mining companies are switching to modular shocks. A mechanic's design is challenging a billion-dollar industry." For the first time, the conversation wasn't about novelty, it was about performance and economics. But as demand grew, Elias faced a new kind of challenge, one he hadn't dealt with before: competing interests from within. Some African investors wanted to go premium and chase military contracts. Others wanted to expand aggressively into international markets. Others wanted to retain strict control and protect industrial sovereignty. And amidst all of this, Elias still remembered the motorcycle taxi drivers, farmers, and delivery workers who had been his first supporters. The path forward was no longer clear. Every choice had consequences: financial, political, and cultural. The letter came from the International Mobility Heritage Foundation, a group known not for patents or procurement, but for preserving the history of transformative inventions like the first jet engine, the first microprocessor, the first electric locomotive. They wanted to archive Elias' original shipping container prototype as part of a permanent exhibit on frontier engineering and disruptive mobility. For a moment, everything stopped. All the legal threats, market strategies, export offers, investor debates, certification labs, and mining contracts faded into background noise. Because what this letter represented was simple and profound: recognition. Not of a product, not of a business, but of the human impulse to solve a problem nobody else bothered to take seriously. Elias visited the empty container one last time, running his hand along the scratched panels, the weld joints, the improvised shelves. He cleaned the old prototype, the ugly but brilliant assembly of motorcycle springs and salvaged dampers. Technicians packed it carefully into a foam-lined crate, and with that, the chapter that began with a broken speed bump quietly closed. From that point onward, the project took on a life beyond Elias himself. The African Mobility Research Council formally adopted the Rugged Utility Vehicle Initiative. Manufacturing plants across southern and East Africa began adapting their production lines. Technical universities added coursework on modular suspension systems. Fleet operators in remote regions standardized on the technology. A global consortium of mining companies released best practice guidelines that recommended the system for rough terrain fleets. Even more surprising, several multinational manufacturers, formerly hostile, shifted tactics. Instead of filing suits or demanding exclusivity, they began offering collaboration, OEM integration, and joint R&D. Market pressure had done what no negotiation could: force respect. Meanwhile, those low-cost units Elias insisted on producing for local taxis and farm pickups quietly became a symbol. They were affordable, reparable, and made for the roads their owners actually drove on. No luxury badge, no marketing hype, just engineering that made daily life less punishing. Years later, when journalists asked Elias what his proudest moment had been, they expected him to mention international contracts, government partnerships, or the museum exhibit. Instead, he told a different story. He spoke of a motorcycle taxi driver who used to replace his rear shocks every 3 months because the roads destroyed them. After switching to Elias suspension, he went an entire year without replacement and saved enough money to pay for his daughter's school fees. That, Elias said, felt more important than any award. In time, analysts would describe the invention as context-driven engineering, praised in textbooks as an example of how innovation emerges not from luxury, but from lived reality. Others would call it a milestone in Africa's industrial autonomy. But the truth was simpler and humbler. It was a solution born from frustration, shaped by necessity, refined by resilience, and recognized by results. A broken speed bump broke a truck. That broken truck broke an assumption. And that broken assumption made room for a new idea, one that traveled farther than anyone expected.